In this lecture, let us look at the most important part of building a startup company, the contracts, and most importantly, the shareholders agreement, or call it the SHA. A shareholders agreement, or the SHA, in short, is an agreement amongst the shareholders of a company. In strict legal theory, the relationships between the shareholders of a company are regulated by the constitutional documents of the company. However, where there are relatively small number of shareholders, like in a startup company, it's a quite common practice for the shareholders to supplement the constitutional documents with a shareholders agreement. Anything that's written in the SHA is subject to negotiation. Therefore, be careful before you sign. Let's look at two things to be very careful about before you sign the SHA agreement. Number one, dilution. When shares are issued, each share represents a percentage ownership of the company, and the person who owns that share owns that much of the company. Dilution is the reduction of ownership percentage of a share stock caused by the issuance of new shares. In simple terms, dilution is when one single share represents less ownership of the company than it used to. This usually happens when new shares are issued. Dilution can also occur when holders of stock options, such as company employees or holders of other optionable securities, exercise their options. When the number of shares outstanding increases, each existing stockholder owns a small or diluted percentage of the company, making each share less valuable. While it primarily affects company ownership, dilution also reduces the value of existing shares by reducing the stock's earnings per share. Let's look at a general example of dilution. Suppose a company has issued 100 shares to 100 individual shareholders. Each shareholder owns 1% of the company. If the company then has a secondary offering and issues 100 new shares to 100 new shareholders, each shareholder now owns only 0.5% of the company. And another thing to note that the smaller ownership percentage also diminishes each investor's voting power. The most important part you need to understand about share dilution is not every shareholder is diluted proportionally, or in simple terms, issuing new shares means some of the shareholders will see their ownership of the company reduced while others may not. The SHA, or the shareholders agreement, might include an anti-dilution clause which exempts some shareholders from dilution completely by simply granting them new shares when new shares are issued. If one or some of the shareholders are not affected by dilution, this dilution will be transferred to those shareholders who are not protected by the anti-dilution clause. This means if you own 20% of the company and dilution happens proportionally, your ownership would be reduced or diluted by 5%, and so will every other shareholders. But if it was the case of unproportional dilution, or where some shareholders are protected from dilution, all shareholders protected by the anti-dilution clause would still have the same percentage ownership of the company, but those who are not protected by the SHA anti-dilution clause would have their ownership reduced even further than if there was proportional dilution. You have to be very careful about these clauses, as you can see your ownership drop every time new shares have been issued. Number two of the things you should be very careful about in the SHA before you sign it. Who sits on the board? The board of directors is like the parliament or the senate of a company. It elects the CEO and can influence or veto decisions made by the CEO. Note that the board is not involved in the day-to-day running of the company. It should not be confused with the management or executive of the company. If you want to spearhead the direction of your company, it's important to have the board on your side and have some influence on who sits on the board. Much like voters determine who is in the Senate, shareholders determine who is on the board. And in the case of startups and companies, these are usually investors, founders, company employees, friends and families, and others. However, not every vote is equal. Some votes carry more weight than others. Some shareholders may have more votes, usually vaguely correlating to the number of shares they hold in the company or by how much they contribute to the company and their negotiation skills. So those are the two most important things to look out for in the shareholders agreement before you sign it. Number one is share dilution, because this will affect your ownership and influence in the company. Number two, who sits on the board. This could be the most important part of the SHA, even more important than share dilution, because Everything written in the SHA is negotiable, and the people who sit on the board are the only one who can change this agreement. They can negotiate who is affected by dilution and who is not, or who is protected by the anti-dilution clause.